Rachel really didn't want to leave the warm and cozy house. Even more so, she didn't want to leave it with her 5-year-old son Kevin, who didn't understand why his mother woke him up so early. Of course, the boy didn't know that his mother didn't do it by choice and that they simply didn't have other options. "I'll have to raise the rent, Rachel. Also, from now on, you'll have to pay for 2 months in advance," said Mrs. Morris. "But you know the position I'm in. I don't have the money to pay you in advance," Rachel objected with resentment in her voice. Unfortunately, the landowner remained indifferent. She was only interested in money, and therefore she already found new tenants who didn't have such financial problems as Rachel did. So all the poor woman could do was take her son's hand and leave the house into the cold winter weather. Shivering in the cold wind, Rachel trudged through the snowy streets and wished she had been born in Florida or Louisiana instead of Maine. Holding her son's hands tightly, the young mother didn't notice anyone around her and simply walked aimlessly down the street. The cold seemed to penetrate the woman to the very bones, and at that point she'd be willing to give anything for a cup of hot tea and a warm bath. Rachel had almost no money on her, and the best she could count on was renting a room in a cheap motel. Immersed in her sad thoughts, the woman didn't realize when she let go of Kevin's hand. The boy got distracted by the playground and stepped onto the road. It took the young mother a minute to comprehend what happened next. At first, she heard the screeching sound of the brakes, and then someone's strong hand pulled her back. Rachel looked up in surprise and saw a handsome, middle-aged man with an aristocratic face standing in front of her. His eyes were glowing with kindness. "Are you rushing to pass into the other world, miss?" the stranger asked with a smile. "Oh no, I just got distracted a little and stepped onto the road accidentally," Rachel said, blushing to the roots of her hair. Only now did she realize that a couple of minutes ago, she was literally on the brink of death, and it was nothing short of a miracle that she didn't end up under the wheels of a car. At that moment, Kevin ran up to Rachel. He was off exploring the snow-covered playground just a moment before. "Mom, can we build a snowman?" the boy asked. Rachel hugged her son, adjusting his hat, which had fallen to one side. At that moment, the stranger standing nearby jumped into action. "I'm pretty sure that you could use some help, am I right? Let's go, before you get your shoes and gloves all wet." Rachel smiled gratefully at the man. As it turned out, her savior's name was Matthew Price, and he was simply passing by at the time of the would-be accident. Soon, Matthew and Kevin built a huge snowman, which made the passers-by smile because of its comical appearance. Rachel was happy to see her son and Matthew work together. Despite looking very put together, Matthew seemed completely immersed in the process. When their gloves were soaking wet, the man invited him and his mother to warm up in a cafe. "Don't worry, it's my treat," Matthew rushed to assure the young mother. In less than a couple of minutes, the three of them were already sitting in a cozy cafe, enjoying an apple pie and washing it down with hot tea. Looking at Matthew, Rachel caught herself thinking that he was handsome. "I'm sure he is a wonderful family man, unlike Glenn, who left me when I was pregnant with his child," the woman thought, taking a sip of hot tea. Rachel was a single mother who had long been used to taking care of everything on her own. The woman's parents were poor and could hardly help their daughter in any way. Meanwhile, Matthew spoke a little about himself. To Rachel's surprise, he turned out to be a successful businessman with multi-million-dollar assets in banks across the country. "I would never have thought that millionaires could be so courteous and friendly," the woman noted with respect in her voice. "Oh, come on, we aren't all pompous snobs and misers," Matthew answered, amused by Rachel's comment. It was clear from the man's face that he wanted to say something else. Something was eating at him from the inside, preventing him from finding peace of mind. Having finally mustered up his courage, Matthew asked, "Please forgive me for this delicate question, but do you and Kevin have a place to live?" Rachel blushed deeply and looked away in embarrassment. She didn't think that her situation was so obvious. Realizing that there was no point in lying, she simply nodded in response. Having gotten confirmation that his assumption was right, Matthew went straight to the heart of the matter. I think that I can help you and Kevin, but I will ask you for a favor in return. Be my fiance. Pretend to be my fiance is what I mean, for a little while. In return, you'll get a place to stay and everything you need for a comfortable life. So, what do you say? Matthew asked, sounding hopeful. Needless to say, Rachel was extremely surprised. She nearly dropped her cup of tea when she heard Matthew's proposal. But why? What do you need it for? The woman asked, having recovered from the initial shock. Matthew coughed in embarrassment and continued. It's for my parents, you know. They're very old school. They have their own beliefs and life philosophy, and they always criticize me for not having a family. This way, I could prove that I have my life sorted out. So, I'm asking you for this favor. Still in disbelief, Rachel looked at the millionaire man sitting in front of her. Just some 10 minutes ago, she'd be willing to bet that Matthew was married and had at least a couple of kids. But then it turned out that the businessman had family problems and was asking the woman who was raising her 5-year-old son alone for help. On the other hand, Rachel understood that everyone has their own problems, which they might not want to share with just anyone. What do I really have to lose here? I still have nowhere to live. And Matthew doesn't exactly look like a villain either, Rachel thought, and accepted Matthew's proposal after a short pause. A glimmer of hope flashed in the businessman's eyes. Thank you for your understanding, Rachel. I promise you won't regret it, Matthew responded empathetically. Then he took Kevin by the hand and led him to his car. Rachel walked beside him, worrying deep down whether she'd made the right choice. On their way over, Matthew told the woman that an important guest was expected at dinner that day, so all the attention would be directed at him. My younger sister got a serious boyfriend. They're thinking about getting married. So, my mother wants to see who her daughter chose to be her life partner, the businessman shared without taking his eyes off the snow-covered road. Rachel shrugged her shoulders. The most important thing for her was that Kevin was comfortable, and she could deal with the rest. She saw the house of Matthew's parents from afar. It was a 2-story building with massive columns at the corners and red tiles on the roof. There were several cars parked in front of the house, which meant that the guests had already arrived. Matthew escorted Rachel and Kevin inside, where they were greeted by the owner of the house. Seeing the young woman and her son, Penelope Price's eyes sparkled with tears. Matthew, why didn't you warn us that you were bringing company? The woman asked with pretend disapproval. Sorry, Mom, I didn't have time to call ahead. Too busy with work and life. Meet Rachel, and this is Kevin, the businessman replied. Soon, all the guests were seated at the table, which was beautifully set for the guest of honor, the boyfriend of Matthew's sister, Gloria. However, the boyfriend himself was running late for some reason and was expected at any minute. Meanwhile, Rachel got introduced to Matthew's relatives, who all seemed to be very nice and friendly. But when Gloria's boyfriend finally showed up half an hour later, Rachel barely managed to restrain her astonished shriek. Lord, this simply can't be happening, flashed through the woman's brain. The fact was that standing in front of Rachel was no one else but Kevin's father, Glenn Norton. Of course, he immediately recognized his ex-fiancée, although he chose not to show it. Instead, he sat down at the table as if nothing had happened and started eating the lasagna. Rachel turned pale and looked away in embarrassment, trying not to meet the eyes of the man who betrayed her 5 years ago. Glenn hadn't changed much in that time. He had the same self-confident look on his face and selfish attitude. Rachel was sure that he was only going to marry Gloria Price for her parents' money. At some point, the woman could no longer bear sitting at the same table with Glenn. Having excused herself from the table, she went into another room and cried softly, covering her eyes with her hands. However, Rachel didn't notice that Matthew followed her. "What happened? Did I offend you somehow?" the businessman asked cautiously. Rachel shuddered and looked at him with eyes full of tears. "It's not you. You didn't do anything. He abandoned me when I was pregnant with our child. He's a horrible person," the young woman answered with a sob. Matthew's face changed instantly as he clenched his fists. The businessman didn't tolerate betrayal in any form, and the secret of Gloria's boyfriend had a deep effect on him. Of course, the man didn't make a scene and patiently waited for the dinner to end. Then Matthew took Glenn outside and shared his thoughts on Glenn's plans to marry his sister. "Rachel told me everything. I don't think there's a place for a person like you in our family. Trust me, there won't be a wedding. Forget the way to our house," the businessman threw in parting. Glenn immediately changed in the face and seemed to have lost his self-confidence. Having pulled his head into his shoulders, he got into his car and started the engine. Glenn realized all too well that 5 years ago, he made a fatal mistake by abandoning his pregnant fiancée. Meanwhile, Matthew went back into the house where he told his parents and sister about the awful thing Glenn did. The businessman wasn't mistaken in his decision, and his relatives were as appalled by Glenn's behavior as he was. His young sister was also shocked by this news. After all, Gloria saw him as a perfect man, a true knight in shining armor. But now, Glenn no longer had a chance at a relationship with her. After their son's story, Mr. and Mrs. Price expressed their gratitude and sympathy to Rachel. "You could stay with us for as long as you need, dear. And Kevin would definitely feel better here than a cheap motel," Penelope Price added. Matthew's lips stretched out into a sweet smile. The man couldn't have even imagined that his parents would like Rachel so much. And the young mother also didn't expect that she would become the center of everyone's attention. Having decided to stay at the Price family home, Rachel never once regretted it. Moreover, Matthew's parents treated Kevin like their own grandson and spent all their free time playing with him. Meanwhile, the businessman behaved like a true gentleman and never allowed himself to be too forward in his relationship with Rachel. But time passed, and the attraction between Matthew and Rachel grew stronger every day. Penelope and Alfred were looking forward to only one thing: when their son would finally announce their engagement. Fortunately, Matthew didn't disappoint his elderly parents, and 2 months later, finally shared the exciting news with them. They held a lavish wedding, which pleasantly surprised the residents of the city. Hugging the bride by the waist, Matthew publicly swore that he would never betray her and would be a faithful and loving husband. Looking at the happy faces of the newlyweds, Penelope and Alfred were confident that their son would keep his word and live a long and happy life with his beloved wife.